Hi everyone, welcome to the January 24th edition of the TimeformUS Pacecast. I'm David Aragona here with my usual co-host Craig Milkowski, and we are recapping this past week in racing. The primary focus of our show is going to be that Fairgrounds Saturday card when they ran the Lecomte Marathon 14 race card. We talked about quite a few of those stakes races on the TimeformUS forecast last week. We'll recap a lot of those races, including those 3-year-old stakes events, the Lecomte and the Silver Bullet Day for the 3-year-old fillies, one of the early Oaks preps. But there was also plenty of noteworthy racing action taking place at other venues. We'll discuss some speed figures that are worth mentioning from Aqueduct on both Friday and Sunday. Also a couple of impressive 3-year-old performances in non-stakes events from the Saturday card at Aqueduct. We saw a very high speed figure awarded to some first-time starters in a maiden race at Gulfstream on Saturday. We'll discuss that, as well as some races from Oaklawn and Turfway, where at that latter venue, they did also run an early Derby prep, a prep for that Jeff Ruby Stakes in Kentucky. So we'll discuss that at the end of the show. But Craig, the focus is going to be at Fairgrounds, and we did see the Lecomte Stakes taken down by the Brad Cox-trained Instant Coffee, and Brad Cox certainly has a full hand of Kentucky Derby contenders at this early point in the season.
Yeah, I'd even say he has a couple hands full. I can't keep track of all of them. It seems like he has a new one pop up every other day with a big performance in either a maiden or allowance or a stakes race. So still early on the trail. It must be nice to be in his shoes at this point. Instant Coffee ran a very nice race. He's going to get a 108 TimeformUS speed figure for the win. I thought he ran very well. I do think he got a great setup. He's a closer. He's a horse who has never really shown much early speed, even in his debut. But he's also won from off a slow pace before, as we saw in the Kentucky Jockey Club. So certainly a talented colt and a good effort. And I assume we'll see him back in the next leg.
Yeah, I mean, the one concern I have with Instant Coffee is that it seems like as he continues to race, it's taking him longer and longer to wind up and hit that top gear in his races. It's like he's becoming more of this hard and deep closer, whereas he did show a little more tactical speed, at least in that debut race at Saratoga when he was sprinting. But in this race, they weren't going particularly, or they were going pretty fast in the early stages, and he was just towards the back of the pack, a couple lengths behind the second to last runner moving down the backstretch. And you could see Louis Saez was really having to push on him at about the half-mile pole, and it took him the entire run around the far turn to really wind up and hit that top speed. But once they got into the stretch, he was able to wear down a pretty game 2 Phils, who had struck the front at the top of the stretch, looked like he might have something left, and those two battled to the finish line, but Instant Coffee just had that relentless drive to the wire that 2 Phils could not withstand. And not a whole lot of running going on in behind these horses, Craig. Echo again was pulled up in the stretch of this race. He was clearly beaten at that point, though, and good news is that he came out of the race just fine.
Yeah, I think it's just a case of I was wrong in the forecast. I thought he was a horse who maybe would be just as good at 2 turns. To me, he showed he wasn't. And also the fast pace probably had something to do with it. The top 2 finished way, way back in this race. So, yeah, combination fast pace. And I think he's a horse that just wants to sprint.
Yeah, and as for Instant Coffee's prospects moving forward, I mean, clearly it doesn't seem like added distance is bothering him one little bit. This was just a mile and a 16th. He's going to have to go farther if he continues down that Fairgrounds path to the Kentucky Derby, but definitely seems like one that will go longer distances, just as a horse that's going to be a little bit pace-dependent moving forward. So we'll see which races Brad Cox elects to run him in. Let's talk about the race that was run right before the Lecomte. That was the other graded stakes event on this card, the Louisiana Stakes for the older horses, going that same mile and the 16th distance, and much different pace situation here, Craig, as they went much slower on the front end, especially to that half-mile fraction, and you would have thought that might work against a horse like Happy American, but James Graham kept him pretty close to the pace in what was a pretty bunched field moving down the backstretch, and he just has a better turn of foot than any of these rivals he was facing.
Yeah, this was kind of a bizarrely run race where the speed horses didn't really set much of a pace in here. Forza d'Oro being tracked by Zozos, and I'd almost argue maybe they just went too slow and kept everybody around. But Happy American ran really well in here. He's a horse who's in good form. He seems to be showing up, running his race. I'm sure some people will note this race was actually slower on the final time than the Risen Star, but we're giving it a little bit higher speed figure at TimeformUS, a 111. The final time will reflect what we saw. The figure's just, I think, a 106. It is slower than the Lecomte, but it's one of those where it was just so slow early, we had to give it a bit of a pace upgrade to make any sense for the runners in this race.
Yeah, that seems pretty logical because they were really walking on the front end. And I don't know what the rider, or I should say Brian Hernandez, was thinking on Run Classic, who broke from the inside, and he just seemed so content to concede the lead to horses to the outside like Forza Dioro, who really isn't that fast, and just let that horse go to the front end and decided to rate Run Classic in behind that runner. And I think it really cost his mount any chance of winning this race. Run Classic is not a horse that was going to be able to close into a slow pace like this. So that was a perplexing ride for me. And it really messed with the flow of the race. I guess the big surprise here to some would be that Zozos just didn't show up. I was a little skeptical of his chances in this race. I was a little bit, I guess I'll say not thrilled with the visual of his debut, of his return race last time at Fairgrounds, and he just failed to step forward here.
Yeah, he was, in a word, terrible. I mean, he was right up on that close piece and really didn't have any excuse. When the time came where he couldn't make his move, he was actually a little bit slow, caused him to get shuffled out of it, and he just had nothing after that. So it got to be a very disappointing effort for the Brad Cox barn with that one, especially when you consider how weak this older division looks. He looked like maybe a horse who could take a step forward, but as you noted, that debut maybe wasn't as good as it seemed. And the speed figure kind of reflects this is just another one of those older horse races that they're just not very good.
Yeah, it seems like these are not among the best horses we'll see in that handicap division. I know we saw a horse like Olympiad emerge in these stakes races last year. I don't think we're seeing quite that level of talent in at least this Louisiana Stakes from last Saturday. Just before that, they ran the Silver Bullet Day. This was one of those early preps for the Kentucky Oaks, and once again, Brad Cox dominance in this one as he sent out the top two finishers who finished well ahead of the rest of their rivals. The Alice Look, though, caused the slight upset as she was able to beat the heavily favored Chop Chop to the wire.
Yes, she was a horse I mentioned on the forecast that has just been improving every single time out, and she improved once again from a 98 speed figure last time in the Untappable all the way up to a 106 here. It was definitely a two-horse race, much like what we saw in the Lecomte, with a huge gap back to third in this one, even bigger than that other race, and I thought this one was pretty good. She's a horse who just seems to be moving in the right direction. It was a good battle, but she just proved to be the better horse in the stretch. And Chop Chop, I'm not sure what to make of that one. Seems like she's okay, but I think the reputation maybe exceeds the talent.
I mean, I thought Chop Chop ran her race. If the Alice Look wasn't in here, we'd be singing the praises of Chop Chop for nearly running as fast as the Lecomte and beating this field by over a dozen lengths. But I guess the big surprise was that the Alice Look took that big speed figure jump forward and was able to beat her stablemate here, because I don't think too many people thought that the race that she had been coming out of last time, I think it was the Tiffany Lass, or the Untappable, was the strongest race for the 2-year-old fillies that we had seen. Pretty Mischievous, who had won that race. She's okay, but had been easily beaten by Hoosier Philly in her prior start. And the Alice Look just really improved off that performance. So Brad Cox apparently has some good 3-year-old fillies in the barn, in addition to his strength among the males. A little bit earlier in the day at the Fairgrounds, they ran the off-the-turf Duncan F. Kenner Stakes. And we don't have to spend a whole lot of time on this one, Craig. It didn't look like the most interesting race coming in when it came off the turf, and pretty logical result here as Surveillance, who just seems to love Fairgrounds, got the job done at a short price.
He did, and this was a race that was probably affected by the pace. We gave it another race. We gave it a pace upgrade. It was only a 5.5 furlongs. For that distance, they were pretty much crawling on the front end. Surveillance was nearly at the back. The only horse behind him was Manny Wah, and he was able to win pretty easily. He got by Bango, pretty late stretch, but to be honest, it never really looked like he wasn't going to get by Bango. His speed figure wound up being a 114, so he's a horse who's doing well. It's obviously his third win in a row, but I think there might be a little more in the tank for this one in a more truly run race.
Yeah, it's funny. What Bango is to Churchill Downs, it feels like Surveillance is to Fairgrounds, because he is now 6 for 7 at the Fairgrounds and 0 for 15 everywhere else. Just kind of a real funny horse for course, and Surveillance is actually 5 for 5 on the dirt at Fairgrounds. And I saw his trainer, Keith DeSormo, saying after the race that maybe they'd consider going back to turf with him because there aren't really any other dirt sprint stakes races scheduled for the rest of this Fairgrounds meet that suit this horse. So maybe they'd go back to turf if they're going to stay at Fairgrounds, and clearly that's where he seems to do his best work. But I do get the sense he's a better dirt sprinter. I just kind of wonder what his ceiling might be in this division.
Yeah, I think the track definitely plays a part in it. It's not like he hasn't run well at some other tracks, just not quite as good as he does at the Fairgrounds.
They did run 2 stakes races on the turf at Fairgrounds Saturday. I'm not exactly sure why they only took the Kenner off, but they made that decision maybe because of the presence of some real dirt horses in that race. But they did keep on the 8th race, the Colonel E.R. Bradley, going the 1.16 distance with the rails way out, as they have been for all of the turf races at this Fairgrounds meet. And we saw a bit of an upset here, Craig, but I think trips might have had a lot to do with the result, as Gentle Soul was one of the few that just stayed out towards that side rail the entire way, and it seemed to work for him.
Yeah, I kind of got that Churchill Downs turf course last year feeling in these races where it's just a really goofy course. I don't know how much relevance these races are going to have going forward. I mean, Gentle Soul had come in pretty good form. I was a little surprised he was the price he was, but if you don't understand what I'm talking about, all you got to do is go watch the replay. The turf course is basically cut in half by the temporary rail. And then when you watch the horses run, nobody wants to be on the inside of what's left of the turf course. Everybody kind of moves to the outside. Gentle Soul seemed to get the best trip. I thought 2 Emmys ran fine coming off a big layoff. Gentle Soul actually got a 120 speed figure off his 117 a couple times ago. And he is running very well every time he sets foot on the turf, and even won a dirt race, although with a slower figure.
Yeah, and I'd imagine it's a tricky course to ride for some of these jockeys, because these horses are trained to gravitate towards a rail when they're running at top speed, and you could kind of see 2 Emmys get a little bit lost out there in the stretch. He had his head turned to the left, or to the right, I should say, as it looked like James Graham was trying to keep him from drifting inwards towards that left rail, because that's not where you want to be on the turf course right now, and seemed like he just got a little bit off balance in the stretch, and maybe that's what allowed Gentle Soul to run by him. But like you said, I think both of these top 2 ran nice races, and a good 120 TimeformUS speed figure for this race. But again, not sure how much stock you really want to put in the speed figures being awarded on this Fairgrounds turf course, because it's just kind of a quirky situation. Moving on to some non-stakes events from that Saturday card at Fairgrounds. We saw an N1X allowance race run just before that pick 5 sequence kicked off, with some horses that would have been eligible for the Lecomte but decided to go in this spot instead. At the end of the day, I'm not sure how much easier this allowance race turned out to be, Craig, because it got a pretty comparable speed figure. I will say the pace of the race was not particularly quick, and it did favor the front runner determinedly, who was able to get the job done over a somewhat unlucky Tappett's Conquest.
Yeah, it had a weird pace, and it was a little on the slow side early. It kind of sped up between the half and the 3/4 before tailing off a little bit. But it's a race where I used the same variant throughout. It just fit, even though there was a little intermittent rain on and off. The track never really seemed to change, in my opinion. And it was a race that was pretty good. I'll let you talk more about the unluckiness of the horse you scratched from the Lecomte, but speed figure wise, as you said, it's going to get actually the same figure, I believe, a 108.
Yeah, and I think both of the top 2 ran pretty well here, though determinedly, I think, got lucky in a couple of senses. I mean, first, that Tappett's Conquest didn't have the best journey through the stretch, and also the fact that his main pace rival, Invulnerable, just was rated pretty aggressively for some reason. James Graham showed no interest in going for the front end with a horse who had showed 21-1 and 44 speed in his debut. For whatever reason, they rated that horse off a slow pace here, so that helped determinedly. And Tappett's Conquest just was kind of always in the wrong spot. I mean, he was out the back door early. Florent Giroux kept him on the inside in the pocket approaching the stretch, but turned out that there was some I wouldn't say traffic, but just never a clear path to run through. And he eventually tried to squeeze through a really tight opening inside of the winner in the final 16th. And that's always a really tough move for an inexperienced horse. So I think Tapit's Conquest probably ran the best race on this day. I guess it's up in the air how he would have done in the Lecomte. I mean, it's really hard to say because that race was run in a different fashion. But it does seem like, given the comparable speed figures of these two races, that these two horses would have fit pretty well in there. And I think we'll probably see them all converge in the Risen Star next time.
Yeah, and I should say it was actually a 109, so a point faster. I guess I'm not sure exactly why. I'd have to look up. It's not in the chart yet, but yeah, pretty solid effort from those two. But I'm with you. I think Tapit's Conquest is the one you'd want to see out of this one. As for Invulnerable, I guess the pandemic of breeding speed horses just continues in this country. It just seems relentless.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And I kind of agree with your decision not to break out the end of this day. I could see, looking at some of the buyer speed figures, they did it a little bit differently. They have the Lecomte getting an 8-point higher speed figure than determinedly in that allowance race. These are improving 3-year-olds, so I mean, I get going either way. For me, it's kind of a toss-up, but I kind of agree with the way that you did it, Greg. And we'll talk about one more race that took place a little bit earlier in the day, kind of in the middle of that fairgrounds card, and that was a maiden race, one of many maiden races from that Saturday program that was won by First Defender. This was a Steve Asmussen runner that was debuting going the 6 furlong distance for 3 Chimneys Farm. I don't know what was behind this horse, but he certainly ran a nice race on debut.
Yeah, and the word was certainly out on him. He was bet down the 4-5. I saw his name mentioned on Twitter several times before the race was ever run, and he was the goods. He lived up to it. He got a 106 speed figure for the win. Looked very good doing it. The pace was pretty quick, and he was able to set just off of it. I think it was like a 4-point upgrade from the final time figure, but good solid effort. I haven't looked too much at the breeding yet to see what would be expected of him going forward. What did you think of that?
Yeah, I mean, he's certainly one that is bred to stretch out in distance. I think that's one of the exciting things about this horse. He's by Quality Road and the Dam Love and Pride. Some people might remember her. She was a multiple Grade 1 winning router for Todd Pletcher. She went out to California and won the Zenyatta out there. She also won the Grade 1 Personal Ensign at Saratoga. So she's definitely a stamina influence. And I think one of her best foals won the Zia Park Oaks. So there is definitely two-turn breeding on the bottom side for First Defender. So you would imagine he's one that they'll be looking to stretch out probably in his next start, just given the time of year that it is. You want to see what kind of horse you have in the barn. Steve Asmussen, sometimes he rushes these horses along, sometimes he chooses to be a little bit more patient, so we'll have to see which route he decides to go with First Defender. Let's move on to Aqueduct, where we're not going to talk about any of the stakes races that they ran last weekend. There were a couple of them, but they both earned some lower speed figures. But some of the higher speed figures that we did see at Aqueduct were earned in allowance and maiden races. We'll begin with a race from their Sunday card, which was won by Pirate Rick, a horse from the Lynn Cash stable, who has won 4 races in a row in quick succession and seems to really be thriving on that aggressive schedule, because this might have been his best performance yet.
Yeah, I guess he's got to be my new favorite horse, or at least one of them, because he's just keeps showing up. I think this is his 4th win in a row. He's running back pretty often. He's doing it with good speed figures. He actually ran a 123 last time when he won. I think he's getting a 117 for this one. And though we didn't give it the pace notation, it definitely got knocked down because of the slow pace somewhat. The final time was actually a 124. So this horse is just in really great form. He was actually claimed, I think, by Lynn Cash quite a while ago. And it took him a while to come around. He actually struggled with him for a bit, didn't do a whole lot, but it seems like he finally figured him out, and he is just running well and looks prime for stakes races, particularly the way he handled the New York track the last couple times.
Yeah, and it's kind of a different story here. As you said, he got the pace downgrade because he did get to set a slow pace in this race. In his prior start, he got a big pace upgrade for surviving a pretty quick pace. So this is a speed horse that can do it either way. And as you said, the 124 final time number that he got for this race, that is a graded stakes quality number. And I saw our colleague Dave Grenning was talking to Lynn Cash after the race and asking, you got the grade 3 toboggan coming up next Saturday at Aqueduct. Are you thinking about wheeling this horse back in 6 days? And he was playing a little bit coy about it, not revealing the plan just yet, but wouldn't be a surprise to see this horse right back in that race, because that's how he likes to campaign these runners.
Yeah, and so just a brief side note, since we're talking about Lynn Cash, I did see Beverly Park started off 2023 with yet another win. His horse who just won a ton of races last year and just keeps on going.
Yeah, he's a real iron horse, and Pirate Rick would have a long way to go to catch up to that one, but he's certainly achieving the same kind of consistency, at least in this small month-long time period. I should mention, while we're talking about Pirate Rick, and we'll talk about it a little bit more once we get to Saturday's card at Aqueduct, I did believe that there was a pretty significant rail bias over the weekend at Aqueduct, and I think it definitely helped along Pirate Rick a little bit. It also helped along his stablemate Cadre, who was third in this race. Both of those Lynn Cash runners rode the rail throughout, so it might have made the margin of victory a little bit more lopsided than it otherwise would have been, but I'm not sure how much it really helped Pirate Rick, because we knew he was the horse to beat coming in, and he had already run some speed figures that suggested that this kind of result was far from outside the realm of possibility. Let's move on to a race from Friday. Different kind of track condition. Thursday and Friday, they had gotten some rain. It was still pretty wet. And we saw a 9-furlong race contested going over an allowance condition on that Friday card, won by No Burn, a horse who had been in great form last summer when he was initially claimed by Oscar Barrera, had kind of gone off form a little bit towards the tail end of 2022, but this performance suggests that he's back to his best self.
Yeah, he bounced right back. He ran a 120 speed figure, which may be the best one he's run. If not, it's really close. I didn't scroll through his whole PPs. But this was a big effort. I will say I think he might have got aided by what was a really fast pace set by that David Jacobson horse, Little Demon, who has, since he shipped in from Penn, been a really good one and ran a good race here as well. But No Burn just was able to hold that one off and actually pulled away late. Maybe some of it was the rail. I'll leave that one up to you, but I just thought this was a really strong effort from him. Not sure where it came from off those last two efforts, but I should say I don't know what happened the last two times, because he certainly had races like this to run back to, but it just was hard to find off the form he had coming in.
Yeah, I didn't notice any kind of rail bias on Friday's card. It was mostly when the track dried out after Thursday and Friday that I saw that crop up by the first race on Saturday. And actually, No Burn was guided well out into the center of the racetrack for the last portion of this race, so he wasn't really riding the rail. I agree, the fast pace definitely seemed to expose the lack of stamina for a few of his rivals, let's put it that way, because No Burn has definitely handled the mile and an eighth before, and he just seemed to really relish it this day as he was pulling away at the end. Little Demon showed up once again. I mean, he's a horse that was running back on relatively short rest for David Jacobson and put forth a good effort to be second here, but just no match for No Burn. And I'll point out those two poor efforts in his prior two starts. On both of those occasions, he had broken slowly. And I was kind of worried coming into this race that he was a horse that had developed some gait issues, but not the case here. He broke sharply and was back to his old self. And it seemed the public knew, because they bet him down to 5-2. I wasn't expecting him to go off at such a short price in this race, but he was certainly back to the better version of No Burn here.
Yeah, and Little Demon, when you say relatively short rest, it was 6 days. So just something to keep in mind. David Jacobson is back training. It's something we're going to see. And when he does that, it usually works. And even though this horse didn't get the win, he ran just as well as he did last time. So just something to keep an eye out.
And moving on to Saturday's card at Aqueduct, I want to talk about a couple of 3-year-old maiden races. And Craig, I'll put it right out there now. I disagree with a few of the speed figure calls on this card just because of the rail bias. I think that both of the races we're going to talk about here, these maiden races, probably could have had higher figures because these horses rode the inside. And I know there were 3 races on this card that you kind of broke out from the rest. And I think they're all races that came up surprisingly fast, but I think it's due to the fact that those 3 winners rode the rail the entire way. So I'm just going to kind of put that out there as context for discussing these and why I included them. But we'll begin with the last race of the day, a maiden race going the mile distance for the 3-year-olds. And I think Slip Mahoney and Crouppy are 2 pretty promising horses, but they rode the rail the entire way, and I think that has something to do with the fact that they drew 15 lengths clear of the rest of the field late.
Yeah, that's one I definitely need to give another look to because I broke it out from the others, as you note. And when I look at the horses that ran in behind, the variant I used for previous races would actually fit pretty good with them. So, yeah, given the rail bias, which is something I didn't notice, I didn't watch Aqueduct on Saturday, and we didn't have it coded for some reason. I'll have to take a look at that. But, yeah, that's one I would definitely review. So that one could be a good 10 to 12 points faster.
Yeah, and I'll just note, Slip Mahoney's prior race is one that I had kind of been urging you to upgrade from a speed figure standpoint. That was that Tappet Trice Slip Mahoney race, and I think we have that fig a little low. So, I mean, that is just a personal opinion. I mean, that was another day that I think you broke that race out from the rest, and I think it's now twice in a row we've done this, and I believe these horses are better than the figures we've given them in these 2 races. But that said, both Slip Mahoney and Crouppy did ride a bias in this race, so even the figure that they might get if you decide to change it might be a little bit inflated. Moving beyond that, I think Slip Mahoney's a talented horse. He's by Arrogate. The Dam Got Lucky was a grade 1 winning router for Todd Pletcher. I think this is actually a pretty good Brad Cox horse, and he was really game to fend off Crouppy here because Crouppy came into the stretch with a lot of momentum, and Slip Mahoney just never let that horse get his head in front. And when you go back and watch this race, I get those who might say that Crouppy ran the better race because he blew the start, had to make a big move down the backstretch to get back into contention, but that's just Crouppy. We've seen this horse a number of times now, and I think the reason that he's a 5-start maiden is that he just can't get out of the gate and leaves himself with too much to do in these races.
Yeah, and that's kind of unusual for a Todd Pletcher horse. It'll be an interesting one to follow, and yeah, I think Slip Mahoney's pretty good. So I will update on Twitter what I decide to do with this one because it was a tricky situation for sure.
And the other race I want to mention from that Saturday card, which kind of fits into that same conversation, a race that I don't know how fast is the right speed figure to award this race because, I mean, the runners in behind the winner Mama's Gold are not much, but this third race of the day was just a $25,000 maiden claiming race, and I don't know why Mike Maker decided to drop Mama's Gold in for this bottom level tag, but I'm wondering if he's regretting it after the race because this horse is clearly a lot better than a $25,000 claimer. He did ride a bias and set a slow pace en route to this 21-length victory, but, I mean, he ran like a stakes horse in this race.
Yeah, and for now, this one is a 105 speed figure. It was yet another tough call on the Aqueduct surface because the 4th race and the 3rd race kind of really fit together. The 3rd race also, I won't say it had a slow pace. It's going to have some blue fractions only because of how much Mama's Gold drew away from the field and just ran away. If you look at the rest of the field, it wouldn't be considered slow at all. So it's one of those that's kind of tricky for the algorithm, and it was a tough card. So it's one I'm going to review given the information you told me about the bias.
Yeah, and I will say, I mean, even if Mama's Gold gets a higher speed figure here, and I think Beyer gave him like a 96 for this race, which the number probably wouldn't be as high in TimeformUS because he did set a very slow pace, as I said, en route to this victory. So he's going to get that pace downgrade no matter what. And he got a perfect trip here, but clearly, this is a horse that has some talent. He had faced a really good maiden field in his prior race. I think that was one that was won by Mariachi, who has not run back since then, but looks like a very talented New York bred. And we've seen other horses come back out of that race to really do very well and improve their speed figures. So Mama's Gold was claimed out of this race by Chad Summers, and I'll be interested to see what they decide to do with him. Based on this kind of performance, I won't be surprised if he shows up in the Gotham next time, and I think that would be an interesting thing to see, because he definitely ran like the kind of horse that could belong in that race here, just he did it against a very, very weak field.
And one thing I wanted to mention, I'm pretty sure this is the debut for a maiden claiming race on the Pacecast, as long as we've been doing this. Maybe we've talked about one in the past, but if so, I don't remember it.
I can't recall one. Usually I'm pretty good at remembering these things, and it's definitely been a long time if we have talked about one in the past, but it seemed like this one was worth discussing, because it's not every day you see a horse win races by 21 lengths going 6 furlongs. Let's move on to Gulfstream Park, and we're going to stick with the theme of some maiden races that came up shockingly fast, and that was the case on Saturday when they ran this 1.16 maiden special weight for the 3-year-olds, and these two first-time starters, Far Bridge and Carl Spackler, I mean, you could kind of tell when you saw that time flash up on the screen, if you remembered how fast the stakes had run just 3 races earlier, that this race could potentially get a huge speed figure, and you could just see it in the gaps between runners at the end, that these two finished far ahead of the rest, and kind of feels like these might be 2 future stakes horses.
Yeah, this was a fast race. This is one that my assistant does. He handles most of the tracks that have synthetic courses, so Gulfstream has shifted over to him. And my note when I sent them the worksheet for the day was, good luck with race 8, because it was one that just looked very tough. It almost looked out of place. I timed all the Gulfstream turf races, as I almost always do, just to make sure the time was fine, and it was. And it's not like it was a fast pace that led to the fast time either. It was a pretty even pace throughout. So just a fast race, and the big question for us was just how fast. And the way my assistant did it, I have no problems with it. He broke out the later couple turf races from the earlier ones. The horse wound up with a 108 speed figure, I believe it was. And I'll just say it probably could have been faster. If anything, it's a 112 even. So I'm fine with the way he did it. It seems like anything more than that would have just been, it seemed almost otherworldly for a January 3-year-old. So I would be very uncomfortable if I were to give this horse like a 120 or something if we use the same variant for the stakes races. But we'll have a notation in there telling you that maybe it was quicker than we even have it.
Yeah, and when you watch this race, I should say when you watch a lot of turf races for maidens, I mean, it's pretty rare to see a 6-length gap between second and third, and then another 6-length gap between third and fourth in a field of 11 or 12 runners. I mean, that's unusual, especially at a track like Gulfstream where these races come up pretty tough. It looks like there's a lot of talent signed on, and to have 2 horses just absolutely dominate in the way that they did on the turf, that's unusual, and it kind of points out the fact that these two might be horses of talent that you don't often see in these races. And I'll just talk a little bit about each of them from a pedigree standpoint. Far Bridge is definitely the one with the more modest pedigree. He's a Christophe Clement trainee, but he is a Calumet Farm homebred by their recently deceased stallion English Channel, who is probably on his last couple of crops with a horse like Far Bridge. Not a ton of immediate pedigree on the dam side, but I was so impressed with the race this horse ran. I mean, yes, he got a good trip saving ground the entire way, but you could see the 2 runners towards the front end, Fort Wilderness and Carl Spackler, were traveling so easily and had a ton left in the tank coming around the far turn. And at that point in the race, it seemed as if Far Bridge would have no chance to get to these horses, because they could see they had a kick left, especially Carl Spackler, and that one kicked for home. And when Joao Rosario asked Far Bridge for run, he lengthened his stride and had even more to give, which was just surprising for me to watch in real time. And the fact that he was able to get up at the wire was pretty impressive, because like you said, I mean, they weren't like flying home, but they went a pretty solid, even pace throughout, and Far Bridge just kept ratcheting up the pressure. And when you look at the Gmax fractions, even by 16th in the Gmax chart, you could just see just the steadiest pace that this horse had set through the finish line. So really impressive run. And as for Carl Spackler, he is a Lope de Vega homebred. The Dams in Daya was a really good runner for these connections. A multiple stakes went around the turf for Chad Brown. So these two, Far Bridge and Carl Spackler, they probably have futures in stakes company, though the latter does still have to break his maiden.
Yeah, he'll be 1-9 that day, no matter where he shows up, I would imagine.
Let's move on to Oaklawn Park, where on Friday they ran an allowance race for older horses. And Osborne, Craig, a horse that we've definitely handicapped on the forecast a few times, he finally got that second career victory. He had, I believe, won his second start as a 2-year-old and had placed in some stakes after that, got stuck in this N1X allowance condition, but finally broke through, and he really did it in style, coming back for his 4-year-old debut, looking like a horse that has really benefited from having that time to mature.
Yeah, it sure seems that way. He was a newly turned 4-year-old, and boy, did he run. I was curious what the speed figure would turn up when I was watching the race, because it certainly looked visually impressive for trainer Ron Moquette. And the number came up as a 120, and it was a pretty consistent day at Oaklawn. It just seemed like he found a new level on Friday. Not sure what happened. As you said, maybe it was just a time off, but it looks like we're starting to get some pretty fast sprinters, at least in some of these allowance races. We'll see if they can transfer it over to Stakes Company.
Yeah, and those the Whitmore comparisons are a little bit inevitable because this horse just kind of looks like Whitmore. He's that chestnut with the white blaze and obviously trained by Ron Moquette. This one's got a long way to go to achieve those kind of heights, but you would imagine it's going to be into a stakes race I believe it's the Count Fleet that they're going to be running soon, and he definitely belongs in a race like that, or the stakes races that they run later in that Oaklawn Park meet, based on the kind of speed figure that he ran here, because this older sprint division, I mean, it seems like when the horses achieve success, it can be fleeting, and especially after the retirement of a horse like Jackie's Warrior, it seems like it could be pretty wide open, so the addition of a horse like Osborne, or the new and improved Osborne, would be welcome. Finally, we'll move on to Turfway Park and talk about a couple of 3-year-old races. Their stakes race that they ran last Saturday was the Leonata Stakes for the 3-year-olds going the 1 mile distance, an early prep for the Jeff Ruby Stakes, and seems like fantastic again. Wesley Ward trainee is establishing himself as an early favorite for that race, because even though he only won by, I think it was 3.5 lengths, could have been a lot more, because this horse was never asked for his best at any point.
No, he's a horse who is clearly loves the synthetic surface. I mean, it's not like he ran terrible. He did win on dirt in an off-the-turf race, but the speed figures are nowhere near what he's been running on to synthetic. Maybe a little bit of that is improving to as a 3-year-old, but it just looks like he really likes the surface. He had ran a 107 the last time he showed up, and this time he ran a 108. And as you said, I'm not one to often say horses could have run faster, but I think he could have run faster.
Yeah, you could see Gerardo Corrales, who was riding this horse, just had a handful the entire way and came into the stretch, looked around for the competition, and there was nobody there. It basically was just like a statue coming to the finish line. And this was only going a mile, but you would think this horse is going to have no problem going further, just given his pedigree. I mean, he's by a horse Fantastic, who a lot of people probably don't remember, but he was a good turf marathoner. I think he might have won the United Nations, or he ran well in that race. So definitely is a horse that's bred to go longer distances. We'll see on which surface he ultimately wants to do it. I think he has run best on synthetic so far, but maybe that dirt race as a 2-year-old just came against too tough a competition for the time of year that it was. He might just be improving overall as a horse since then, so I'm sure he'll get his chance on dirt again eventually. Might not come until the Kentucky Derby if they proceed down this turfway path to the Run to the Roses, but Fantastic again. Definitely a horse that seems like he's going to be a strong contender in that Jeff Ruby Stakes in a couple of months' time. And the other race from Turfway that we should mention took place earlier in the week on Wednesday, a maiden special weight event for the 3-year-old fillies. And not sure where this came from, Craig, because it was a secret to the public coming in, but Garden Bell, who went off at 23-1 as a first-time starter, was certainly ready to go on debut, as she earned a pretty strong 105 TimeformUS speed figure.
Yeah, it's kind of funny. I got a question, I guess, from one of the owners on Twitter in a direct message asking me, private message, whatever they're called, asking me what the figure was for this horse. And I was like, well, heck, I don't know. I'll have to go look it up. I wasn't expecting much. And turns out it was a 105. It was obviously a pretty good effort from her. Not sure where it came from, but who knows? It's on synthetic. Maybe they'll keep her on synthetic, but I don't think she has to be. It's not like she doesn't have some breeding in her pedigree.
Yeah, it's a hard race to figure out because there was some form coming in, but the horses with prior experience, they did no better than fifth in here, and those horses did run back to their prior speed figures, so the number checks out for them, but it was a race where the entire superfecta was first-time starters, so you do have to wonder a little bit about races like that, how many talented horses are really all debuting in the same race, but, I mean, just visually, seems like this horse could be pretty good. She broke pretty well. Watching her, she had easy speed down the backstretch. She kind of let that runoff leader Daring Do go off and do her thing on the front end, but once she was called upon, she reeled that runner in pretty nicely. Changed leads a little bit late, but she was striding out well through the wire, and it just seems like a filly that has a lot of substance to her. I mean, she's a impressive physical from what I could see on the replay, and bred to go longer by Outwork, who's a versatile sire. The dams I have to Lecomte, who was second in the Grade 1 Bluegrass, so I mean, there's some substance here to this filly, and I kind of wonder how good she's going to turn out to be and what route they decide to go, because this is the kind of speed figure that says that they might as well target stakes pretty soon.
Yeah, for sure. And as you were talking, I looked just to make sure, and it was really an easy speed figure to make. It was smack dab in the middle of the card. There were plenty of sprints. It was consistent start to finish, so it seems legit. There was the horse who finished third was a Wesley Ward first-time starter who took a lot of money. She showed your typical Wesley Ward speed, set a good solid pace, but it's not like Garden Bell was way behind it. She was just a length behind after a quarter, and the main chaser, and was just able to wear that one down, and just it was a good performance, I think.
I agree. She's a horse that I think I'm excited to see where she goes next, because this is one that seems to have some talent. Well, those are all the races to recap on the podcast this week. Craig and I do have a big week coming up of video previews and further podcasts. With it being Pegasus World Cup week, we'll be doing a few videos that you can check out on DRF's YouTube channel, and we'll also be trying to get that TimeformUS forecast out a little bit early this week. I think we're planning to record tentatively on Thursday, so look for that then, and we will be talking, of course, about that Pegasus World Cup card, probably going over that late pick 5 sequence that is all stakes races. And Craig, I've taken an early look at it, and I've seen some people lamenting the fact that we're lacking some of the star power that we typically see on the Pegasus World Cup day card, but it's a trade-off in racing these days. I mean, when you get the stars, that's when you sometimes see the 5 and 6 horse fields, and we're definitely not getting that on Saturday. They are some large fields and seemingly wide open races.
Yeah, and I'll be honest, I prefer that way, the way we're getting it. I'm a guy just like you who bets horses, and I want to get the cards where they offer some good bets. So I'm looking forward to it, and maybe some stars will emerge. You never know in these races. And I'm going to have plenty of time to handicap, because as I look out the window here in Oklahoma City, it looks like we're getting a pretty heavy snowstorm. So I'm not going anywhere. I'm going to be buried in these TimeformUS PPs.
Perfect, because there is a lot to go through with that card, so snow day is a great day to do some handicapping. Everybody, thanks for listening to the Pacecast this week. Again, remember to catch that TimeformUS forecast coming up on Thursday, and you can always catch these TimeformUS podcasts on DRF.com, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. Wherever you get your podcast, just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Form channel. Again, thanks to the listeners, and make sure to catch out that forecast coming up later in the week.